Hello and welcome to The Bonesmith and You, a series where we take a deep dive into the various aspects of Kingdom Death Monster. My name is Fen, and in this video we're going to be looking at the Skinnery's offensive partner, the Bonesmith. The Skinnery is focused around turning hide resources into forms of defense through armor points, bleed removal, insanity gain, survival actions, evasion, and a big side dish of AI control. The Bonesmith, on the other hand, complements this with a focus on conversion of bones into weapons. It also has a head protection option here and 2 hunt-based survival resource generators. So the Bonesmith is a settlement level 1 crafting location. That is not an in-game term, that's just something I use to shorthand how far away a given location is from the very starting settlement location. It helps me give an approximate power level, and I can then think about where I'm slotting the monster crafting locations in, if they're significantly more powerful or less than the generic core options. The Bonesmith is very cheap to craft. It costs 1 endeavour and no other resources. So before we move on, a quick note about how I assess resources. I look at them in 2 ways. First one is the cost, the direct cost of what you spend in numerical values. So I do class endeavours as a resource for this purpose. So for example here, this innovate is 1, 2, 3, that's 4 resource cost. But also, I like to put a resource value on different things. It's very subjective, but it helps me work out what resources I should be spending in situations where I need to spend a generic resource. My system for the early game is I class endeavours as being worth 2 points. I can class bone as being worth 1 point. Organs I class being worth 3 to 4 points, and hide 5 points. So hide is 5 times more valuable than bone for me. The reasons for these weightings are endeavours can be used to make gear, they can be used to make settlement locations, they can be used to make an item, a fairly useful item. So I don't want to just mindlessly spend my endeavours. Bones, on the other hand, in the early game, you only need 1 weapon in your gear grid, and typically it's going to only cost 1 bone to make. Organs, you've got 9 slots. 5 of them are taken up by hide, thanks to Rawhide armor, so you've got these 3 slots left for usually organ-based stuff. So I class them worth about 3 points because that's about 3 resources worth of gear cards. It varies. However, I recommend that you think about this and work out your own weighting system as to how you're going to look at various different things. You don't have to ascribe points to it because ultimately points value changes a lot as you go through the campaign. For example, scrap is almost worthless at the very beginning of the campaign, but once you have various settlement locations unlocked or you have heat, scrap starts becoming way more valuable because it's used for a lot of different powerful things. So that's just something to bear in mind, because I am going to be talking about both resource cost and resource value when I go through each gear card in the Bonesmith. However, before we go any further, let's go and look at the endeavour on the Bonesmith. So this is a settlement location unlock. It'll unlock the weapon crafter, making the weapon crafter the basic settlement crafting level 2 location. Yeah, it's fairly standard. This all 3 of the beginning crafting locations have this progression. Here we have to pay a endeavour and 3 bone and a hide to unlock. That's actually the cheapest of all of the costs we have to pay. So you can get the weapon crafter open a little bit earlier if you want to when compared to the others. However, I would have some caution in regards to it. There's not a lot of point in rushing the weapon crafter most of the time, because some of the things you may want to craft require heat, and heat takes a little while to get You're gifted it in some campaigns. In others, you're going to have to innovate ammonia and then get whatever heat given innovation does the job, which varies. This lantern oven in the core game. But there are a few situations where I would say you get a point where it's worth opening the weapon crafter. This isn't a given lantern year thing. It's not like, oh, lantern year 7, you must open the weapon crafter, because Kingdom Death is far more contextual and reactive than that. It all depends on what resources you've got, what monsters you've been hunting, what weapons you already have. There's a lot of different decisions to make. But the two places where I will start to think about the weapon crafter are, first of all, when I have got 2, maybe 3 rawhide sets and the bandages together, and I've already opened the leather worker, because the leather worker I think is more important to get open than the bonesmith. The weapon crafter from the bonesmith. So that's, I'll usually open the bonesmith last out of the 3 of these. So not bonesmith, I apologize. The weapon crafter. I'll usually open the weapon crafter last out of the 3 of these. So my priority ordering is typically leather worker, barber surgeon, weapon crafter. But that can change. And one of the big things that alters it all is this here, the perfect bone. So this mind-numbingly perfect bone is in the basic resource deck. It's a single drop in there. It's quite hard to get, but when you do get it, you have the ability to craft one of the rarer sort of prestige craftable weapons, the Zambato. The Zambato is a very effective, very strong, very useful weapon that has a great weapon type in Grand Weapon, and also has a lot of synergies with some really sweet stuff in the Dung Beetle Knight. So it's not like it used to be, where you would make the Zanbatos, a lot of them, and you would be doing it like with White Lion resources. Things are more balanced now, and you are going to instead be crafting this when you have the opportunity, which is given to you by getting a perfect bone. However, you might have other uses for the perfect bone in mind, so again, this is all very subjective. Okay, so we're now going to look at the gear and walk through them. Just to be upfront, talk about this, I am going to discuss and dissect the bone blade in a lot of detail, because this is a good weapon to describe the various things you want to be thinking about in respect to a given weapon. And it's also a very good baseline comparison, because I think out of anything, the bone blade is mostly the default starting weapon that you would think of. Partly because of its cost, but also because, you know, it's a sword made out of a bone, and you can't really resist that a lot of the time. So, when assessing any kind of a gear card, I'm going to consider crafting cost and value, then keywords, then whatever weapon proficiency you have on it, then abilities, negative or positive, affinities, and finally the weapon profile. So that's the order I'm going to be going through with everything here. First of all, the crafting cost. This is 1 bone. That's about as cheap as any weapon will ever be in this game. It's a very, very affordable amount, and as such, you're probably going to be crafting some of these, depending on your settlement, your playstyle, and similar. When it comes to the various keywords it has, every weapon has weapon, but not everything with an attack profile is a weapon, worth noting the difference. And we're not going to discuss if something is a weapon, because that's kind of the default. We will talk if something isn't a weapon and still has an attack profile, though. Then we have the type of weapon, specifically what range it's effective at. Melee is your default. It's also got the highest number of synergies to connect with things like armor sets. Typically, most armor set synergies relate to melee weapons. That is changing as time moves forward, but in the core game in particular, melee is covered by most of the monster-based sets. Ranged is more powerful than melee, and we'll discuss why when we get to the ranged weapon in this selection of gear. But there's also a third type which is even more powerful, and that is melee and ranged. You get the benefits and drawbacks of both, but you get to ignore the drawback of melee being quite short range and having not a great threat area, forcing you to be more in the monster's face or near the monster, and thereby making your life more dangerous. We'll skip over sword for the moment, and we'll just look at this. So you'll have like property or material keywords that will describe something, an aspect of the given gear card or weapon. These don't do anything by themselves. However, some of them can have positive impact, some of them can be very negative, and you'll learn as you play which ones are good, which ones are bad. But I'm also always going to highlight when there's a unusual or unique keyword. Bone is one of the positive keywords. We'll talk about it here because it's pretty much on every single piece of gear in this crafting location. But bone has a bunch of positive synergies. There's some specific gear that wants you to have all bone gear in your gear grid. Also, there's benefits for if you're playing People of the Skull. So bone is pretty much a positive keyword. It's nice to see. It's also a default for this location. Now we'll get onto the weapon proficiency. So sword is kind of what I would consider a default weapon type. And that's the breakdown of what you want to consider when you're thinking about a weapon type and its proficiency is how easily available is it to get started on this weapon? So can I get this weapon early? Secondly, do I have good progression with this weapon? So am I going to be able to swap it to a better version at reasonable beats through the campaign and keep scaling my weapon's power to keep up with the monsters as they get tougher and more dangerous, so we can progress rather than farm weak monsters over and over, because some people may enjoy that. I personally don't. I like to be challenged and I like variety in my experience. But then the other thing you want to consider is the specialization and mastery. So the sword specialization is when attacking with a sword, after drawing hit locations, make a wound attempt and then select the hit location to resolve with that result, limit once per attack. So this allows you, instead of having to choose a hit location and go, I will now attempt to wound this one, you get to make a wound roll right at the start and you can apply that to any of the hit locations that you draw. This naturally synergizes with higher speed, which is great, and swords do get a little bit above average on their speed, so that's a good synergy to have. It's also really good if you have deadly, because you can roll the dice, and if you score a critical wound on a Lantern 10, you can assign it to your preferred Lantern 10 hit location and gain those benefits. That's pretty sweet. But the main reason I think of sword as being the default is if we flip it, this mastery is pretty okay. +1 accuracy is great. +1 strength is, at this time in the campaign, probably not that relevant. And +1 speed does have synergy with the weapon specialization, but this isn't one of the top weapon proficiencies and masteries. I would probably put this at like middle of the table, which is why I kind of think of it as the default. It does get better with some expansions, and there are some really great sword synergies out there. It's probably the most synergized and referenced sword, weapon proficiency type in the entire game. There's so many things that interact with swords, so it's just worth bearing in mind. But for me, at the start of the campaign, I'm probably not going to be rushing to get a sword master very early, but I might consider it if I'm looking to play around with the weapon crafter sword. So kind of default, it's a good comparison to make with everything else. Then we'll look at abilities. The Bone Blade has a negative ability. Sometimes I call these negatraits, to roll together negative abilities and negative keywords, if we have any. This one is Frail. almost every weapon in the Bonesmith has Frail. I'll talk about it once here, and then we will just consider it to be like defaulted, already discussed, when we get to the other weapons. So Frail is when you attempt to wound a superdense hit location, the weapon breaks and you archive the gear card at the end of the attack. So that's the reason this is a negative trait, because the weapon can undo itself. You can lose everything you've invested and you can not have a weapon for the rest of the fight, and you'll have to craft a new one. It's not such a big deal with a Bone Blade for a few reasons. First of all of the early game monsters have just one super dense location. Let's put an asterisk into the Butcher. We'll get to him when we talk about the Bone Axe. And the White Lion has none at all, so you can avoid this deal by just hunting White Lions, and it's a very low risk situation against monsters with a super dense location. You've got a whole load of ways of mitigating this. A very basic simple one is don't attack until the super dense location is in the discard pile, and you do other things. You do hit location control, or maybe AI control, or some bandaging, or you collect terrain, that kind of stuff. And then when the super dense location is in the discard pile, you get in there and you get stick in with your blade and smack them about a bit. Another thing you can do is when other survivors have graduated to non-frail weapons, you can put multiple copies of your frail weapons into one survivor's gear grid if they have space for it, and then they can just go wild and not worry about it at all. Just, if I break this weapon, I'll pull out my next sword and the one after that, and maybe even the one after that. So it's not a huge deal overall. The last thing is Frail's vulnerability varies depending on speed. A 1-speed Frail weapon is less vulnerable than a 2 or even a 3-speed, so that's always worth bearing in mind. And finally, if you like playing hit location control, if you're a very controlling player who likes to dominate the monsters during the showdown and be very methodical about it, you can just use hit location scouting or hit location control to ensure you don't collide with the super dense hit location when attacking with a frail weapon. So this is a perfectly fine downside. Next up we have Affinities. Quick brief run through of the importance of the Affinities. A lot of them link to various support items, specifically ones that are in the organ grinder. I've talked about those in that particular video. So I'm just going to quickly say, as everything in this crafting location, apart from the tools, has red affinities. This is the best red affinity direction. It connects to the Monster Tooth necklace, but more affinities is always better. So this has the best single affinity it could possibly have. It'll also connect to the Rawhide vest if you don't have the gloves crafted yet because you haven't made enough hide. So it's a great affinity. It's also one shared by the vast majority of the weapons in this set. Okay, let's get on to the meat of the Bone Blade, so to speak. Our weapon profiles are broken apart into 3 separate stats, but they're all kind of interlinked. And I'll work through each one individually, but I'm also going to talk about some of them in connection with each other because it builds up an entire picture of what makes a weapon good and what doesn't. So our first stop is speed. Speed's complicated. Speed depends on your playstyle. In essence, the lower your speed, the longer the showdown fight is going to take. The longer it takes, the more opportunities you have to control the monster and generate favourable outcomes from attacking the monster. But also, very importantly, the better your defences are going to need to be because the monster will get to attack you more often. And that could be quite scary. Not more often, I should say. More times over the length of a longer showdown. It'll get more of its AI actions, and they're the really powerful ones. As we go up the speed, we sacrifice control for pace. So we get tempo, would be a very good way to think of it. But also, the more attacks you're making against the monster, the more reactions you're going to be dealing with, and the more often you will see the trap card. So the monster is also going to accelerate its plan of damaging your survivors and removing your units from the board. So that's a playstyle decision. Some people are very happy to roll one dice, and they're okay if that dice does nothing at all. Some people love rolling a handful of dice and they want high speed. There isn't a absolutely right answer, but between 1 and 3 speed tends to typically be the best, with 2 being the sweet spot. 4 or more speed is for specialised builds. Some weapons do great jobs at high speed. Some of them just get you in trouble a lot. And a great deal of that depends on accuracy and the strength of the weapon. So we'll get on to accuracy. This is a very simple thing. It essentially tells you what percentage chance each speed dice has that they're going to convert into a hit and draw you a hit location. 6+, that's your basic 50%. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that's half the results on a d10. So you're going to get your successes half the time. To just provide an example of understanding what that means, we know a 2 speed 6 plus accuracy weapon is going to hit with 1 hit half the time, it's going to miss 25% of the time, and it's going to score 2 hits 25% of the time, which means it's going to score 1 or more hits 75% of the time. So you can kind of think of that as being the accuracy. I'm not going to do the accuracy for every single weapon. It's complicated, especially because there's a whole bunch of different sliding things that can occur around weapons. But 2 6+ is like your typical profile you'll see on a lot of weapons. And the main things to consider with accuracy are the higher accuracy is, as in lower numbers, is generally better, but there are some weapons that have troublesome properties, low strength, that you may want lower accuracy on, so you're going with more variance. You're rolling more dice, and those dice individually hit less, but on the whole they will pay off to be about the same. We'll see an example of that in the next weapon. Finally, we have strength. Of all of the 3 stats, strength is the most important one. Sure, speed tells you how many dice you roll, accuracy tells you how many of them turn into hits, but strength, deadly aside, luck-based stuff aside, strength tells you how likely you are to convert that hit into a wound. Now, this is quite complicated. The simple answer is you always want as much strength as possible. You cannot have too much strength. If you've got a 30 strength weapon, good on you. Enjoy those 2+ wounding. It's fantastic. But that's not really a helpful metric to be considering. So what I tend to look at is, what's the minimum strength I want on a weapon for the monster I'm going to hunt? So let's get into the specific examples of what you're going to be doing with your bone weapons when you go to hunt. And you'll hunt the level 1 white lion. Well, typically, unless you're very, very brave, there'll be a level 1 white lion. So the level 1 white lion has 8 toughness. So we know that we need to get an 8 or more between our survivor, our items, and our weapon's strength. Let's assume we do not have any strength on our survivor and we just have this bone blade. That's 2 strength. So we look at our d10 and we see which results are going to give us an 8 or higher. And we can see that 6 + 2 is 8. So we know now 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's going to wound half the time. Now, you need to figure out what threshold you're comfortable with. Personally, I don't like a 50% chance of wounding. And the reason for that is how the dynamics of the fight work. So, when the monster attacks you, it's going to have very high accuracy, it doesn't need to make a toughness roll, and it can deal multiple points of damage in a single hit. It has a really great attack. Because there are 4 survivors, you guys all get not so good attacks. And you really need to make them count. So there's a few different scenarios that can happen. Number one, you attack and you miss. You've wasted your attack. That's it. Your activation is spent for no benefit. But then there is you attack and you hit, and you draw that hit location. There's a few things to consider here, as there are multiple different types of hit locations. Our very first thing we desperately want to consider, we really need to hold in mind, is every card we draw gets us closer to the deck refresh punishment, also known as the trap card. You've got to hit the trap card sometimes, but you do want to be methodical about who hits it, because if the wrong survivor runs into the trap card, they maybe because they're really injured, or they are your frontline tank and they need the armor points to stay up against the monster, it can be a terrible situation. So that's the first consideration. The second one is reactions. We have critical wound reactions. They're amazing. They let you skip lots of nasty stuff. There's very rare that you get punished for a critical wound. But there are three other kinds of reactions. We have failure reactions, we have wound reactions, and we have reflex reactions. Let's go through each one in turn and talk about what the best thing is. We'll start with failure reactions. If you fail to wound, then the monster gets to do its reaction and punish you. That means your attack has effectively converted into the monster progressing towards killing you in some method. That's not great. So really you want to wound. Then there's wound results, wound reactions. I apologise, wound reactions. Wound reactions punish you for actually wounding. So if you fail to wound, all you've done is you've drawn a hit location for no effect. But if you do wound, you get to deal that wound and you get punished for it, which is okay because both you and the monster have progressed towards victory. It's the price you pay for dealing wounds sometimes. Finally, we have reflex reactions. These are going to happen unless you get a critical wound, so you just gotta suck it up. But obviously, if you get a failure and you get hit by a reflex, the monster progresses its goals. You do not progress towards your victory. That's bad, so you want to wound. And that's the things you want to be thinking about, and it brings us to a very key point. It's better to attack and miss than it is to attack, hit and fail to wound. Because if you attack and miss, that's it. There's not really any downside unless you're facing a specific monster that somehow punishes misses, which is rare. But if you attack and hit, you've exposed yourself to all of these reactions, you've accelerated hitting the trap, so you've potentially made the situation worse for yourself unless you convert it to a wound. So that's why attacking, hitting and failing to wound is worse than attacking and missing. And that's why strength is absolutely the king of your stats. Now, let's get back to thresholds. Because of all of this, you need to think to yourself, what's an acceptable threshold for me? How often do I want to be converting my hits into wounds? What am I okay with? For myself, I want at least 60%, so that means, on average, my wounds against the monster are favouring my side, and at 50%, you're just kind of coin flipping, depending on reactions, etc., obviously. And I don't think that's good enough. So I want to be getting to 3 strength, because 3 plus 5 is 8, and that is a 60% chance of success. Obviously I would like more, but that's my minimum baseline. Is I will look at the monster I'm hunting and I'm going to say, okay, this monster has, say, 10 toughness. Right, so I want to be wounded on a 5 plus, so I need to get 5 points of strength from elsewhere to get it to the state I'm happy with, and ideally I go past that. There's a number of ways you can do this. Survivor of the Fittest is a big one. That's your birth principle, +1 strength, +1 evasion. That's a nice thing to do. And we'll get back to it in a moment. But then also you can use the Monster Tooth Necklace, or even as your survivor levels up, they quite often get extra strength, and that can help as well. So with a bone blade here, 2 + 6, that's not good enough for me. But if I have triggered my birth principle in the first lantern year and I pick survival of the fittest, I get an extra 1 strength. So I am now going 2 + 1, 3 + 5, 8, wounding 60% of the time. So that's my recommendation, is I think the bone blade is better if you have survival of the fittest. If you don't, you're probably going to be taking some anyway, because it's early game and you have to, like, you've got to have something. You don't want to be attacking with a founding stone or your fists, not against the level 1 lantern year 1 white lion or gorm, because that's one of the most dangerous fights you're going to walk into outside of nemesis battles. So yeah, bone blade, not my preferred choice. But also your very first bone should not go on the bone blade. It should go on the ranged option in here. We'll discuss why in a moment. So ultimately, that's where I land. I think the bone blade is a little below what I want it to be, but it is acceptable if I've got survival of the fittest. And also, rolling 2 dice feels better than rolling 1 dice, and fun matters. I don't have fun when I'm rolling a single dice and I miss. I like the sound of dice in my hand rattling away. I like the sound of multiple dice in a dice cup rattling away. So I am still going to lean towards the bone blade because of the F factor, the fun factor. Right. Let's go on to our second weapon. This is the bone dagger. It is also costing just the 1 bone to craft, so it is as efficient as you could possibly want. It has the same keywords as the bone blade, so we don't need to discuss those outside of a quick look at dagger. So dagger specialization and mastery is really unique. It's really powerful. It's great. The specialization, as you can see here, is when attacking with a dagger, if a wound attempt fails, after performing any reactions, you may discard another drawn hit location to attempt to wound that hit location again. That means if you've got a hit location that you really don't want to be rolling against, it gives you a reroll against one of the remaining hit locations. And so that ties into one of Dagger's designs, which is high speed. Daggers often start at 3 speed and climb upwards, or they're used in a paired fashion. The mastery is super fun. I really love this mastery. After a wounded hit location is discarded, a dagger master who is adjacent to the attacker and the wounded monster may spend 1 survival to redraw the wounded hit location and attempt to wound with the dagger, and then you treat monster reactions on the redrawn hit location card normally. This is super fun and it helps improve your DPS. However, daggers have a few issues in their design. They are the high speed, low accuracy, low strength build type weapon. And as mentioned previously, and when I talked about the Rawhide whip, that can be a problem. So the bone dagger exemplifies this over here with its stats. And what that means is you kind of want to have really high personal strength if you're using daggers, because the weapon itself is not going to support that. Also though, you can use white line armor to supplement the strength even further, and we'll discuss white line armor in the future. Ultimately, when we get back to it, the bone dagger is a good weapon type, but it's not one I'm particularly wanting to get in the early game. It's not in the top 3, it's probably not even in the top 5. So at this stage, dagger isn't going to draw me in. This doesn't have Frail though, and that is a nice positive. It also has this neat ability, but it's not as good as it could be. So on a perfect hit you gain 1 survival, and this explains perfect hit mechanics. That's a Lantern 10. Some things can increase the range that you score your perfect hits on. That varies. But in the early game, survival is almost exclusively used for defensive actions. You're using it to dodge and encourage. You haven't unlocked dash or surge at this point, or whatever specific campaign survival actions you have. So this survival is exclusively defensive, Now the trouble there is the synergy between this weapon profile and this is very low, because if you're stabbing the monster a lot with high speed, low strength, you're going to be taking a lot of reactions, and that hurts. That sucks. So you can't really use this as a tank weapon because it's going to get you in trouble. It is worth noting though, these affinities are really good. Left, great. Up, red, great. And this has some synergy with white line armor again, so we're definitely going to be mentioning that in the future. The last thing is his weapon profile. This is one of the kind of common weapon profiles. You'll see it on a few different weapons. Rawhide Whip, for example, has it. This isn't great, but if you have a lot of strength, it can be. So ultimately, I'm not going to craft the Bone Dagger in Lantern Year 1, but I may craft it if I'm doing stuff with White Lion armor, because of its affinities and its synergies. So ultimately, I don't think this is great. If you really want to play daggers, the Gorm has some amazing and really fun ones that also work well paired. So probably consider getting the Gorm if you are somebody who wants a dagger experience and starting early. Right, let's get on to the Bone Axe. This costs 1 bone and 1 organ. That makes it twice as expensive on a cost value than the bone blade. It's also an organ, and an organ is significantly more valuable than a bone. If this costs 2 bones, or this costs a bone and an endeavour, that would be like a serious consideration for it not being as expensive. So this is an expensive weapon to craft. At least it costs maybe 2 to 3 times more than the bone blade, so that's kind of the power level you're hoping to get out of it. Now what we do get is an axe. Axes are really good. Axe specialization is great. It's like an alternative of the dagger and sword ones. It gives you a reroll when you fail. You can do it on fail to wound. You can do this once per attack. That's fantastic. The mastery is phenomenal. It's when you wound an axe with a location that has a persistent injury, that wound becomes a critical wound. Automatic critical wounds into persistent injuries is incredible. It's really, really good. If you said that axe was the 4th best mastery in the game, I would be like, that's a fair opinion to have, and I would probably agree with you. I think Fist and Tooth, Shield and Spear are all better and more important. So, it's a good weapon type. I don't think there's any debate about that. And it also has Savage, which is a fantastic ability if you combine it with extra luck and deadly. But we don't have that here. So instead, Savage kind of just means for every 10 wounds you deal, you should on average deal 11 total. It's a benefit, it's a positive, but it isn't necessarily the best. And so I would consider Savage here to just be a net neutral. It's not bad, but I can't rely on it, so I don't think I can be saying, hey, this is good, you should always be crafting axes because of Savage. I just don't think it's a consideration. So then that leaves us looking at a few last bits and pieces. First of all, the strength. The strength is right on the nose what I want, but 3 strength isn't twice as good as 2 strength. In fact, 3 strength is not really something I care about, because if I want a 3 strength weapon, I've got one right next to it over here that I would prefer to be crafting, and I need to craft one of these. So the bone axe is starting to lose some traction. Additionally, the butcher is quite a issue where axes are concerned. So first of all, the butcher is a fast target. That means it reshuffles its hit location deck and discard pile every single turn. So you hit the trap more often, and significantly you hit super dense locations more often. It only has 1 in the deck, but it's going to feel like more because it has a smaller deck size and it does that shuffle every single turn. You'll see super dense locations more often against the Butcher, which means I'm more likely to break the axe while fighting the Butcher. That's not good. That's kind of a bit of a problem, in fact. Also, though, when you beat the Butcher, you get +1 weapon proficiency in axe on all of the survivors that have gone into the showdown. While it's nice to put +1 weapon proficiency onto a survivor that already has 2 of it, it's often better to get it on survivors who have no hunt XP and no proficiencies at all, brand new survivors, because they get to start work on leveling up their weapon mastery earlier in their lifespan than a normal survivor would. So I would typically prefer to take 4 new fresh survivors in to fight the Butcher, partly because the Butcher's pretty scary and partly because if they survive and get axe, I can now start working on getting myself an axe master because I got a leg up on it. I'm behind on the campaign timeline, but that should be okay because I would hopefully be progressing other weapon types already. So ultimately, I'm not going to take the bone axe in People of the Lantern very often. In People of the Sun, I will, because you don't run into Nemesis monsters early during that campaign, so the bone axe has a lot more viability for a lot longer, which is great. So I may be considering it there because it's going to go a longer distance without me worrying about losing it. But mainly, if I want to play with axes, I've got to consider the progression in the core game, and it is bone axe and then nothing until you unlock the weapon crafter, and you get a very good axe, but that means the bone axe needs to last until you unlock the weapon crafter. And as mentioned before, for my personal priority, it's a bit further down the list than both of the other 2 unlock options. So again, this bone axe needs to last quite a number of years, and I just don't think it's going to hold its ground sufficiently to do that. So instead, if I want to play axes, I will likely add the Gorm in, because the Gorm has 2 really good axes that work well against the Butcher, and that is definitely my preference. So there is only one situation in People of the Lantern that I am going to be looking at the bone axe as a consideration, and that is if the Prologue White Lion drops very little hide and mostly deposits a equal mix of bones and organs. At that point, my defences are not going to be good fighting the level 1 White Lion, and I need to have a good offense to make up for that lack of tanking capability anywhere. The bone axe is definitely going to jump up the rankings in that situation. So it has places where it can be good, but ultimately this 3 strength just isn't enough to carry the weapon, especially when you've got access to bone darts. Bone darts are our very first ranged weapon, so when we discuss the ability down here, we're going to go and take a look at the showdown board to explain why ranged is so good. It's also a thrown weapon. This is the worst weapon proficiency in the game because it doesn't have a specialization or mastery. The rules explicitly say you can't pick it as a weapon proficiency and you can't level up in it. That does bum me out. I'm somebody who recreationally throws knives, and I've enjoyed axe throwing and spear throwing in the past, and it is a very skillful area. I am constantly in awe of the YouTube videos where people demonstrate their skills and abilities and accuracy, and I just, if I could get Team Death to do one thing, it would be to give us that thrown mastery to change this and let us enjoy them. Right, then below we have Frail. Worth noting, as mentioned before, 1 speed with Frail is it's a better combination than higher speed with Frail. It keeps the weapon around longer, and it also has range 6. So let us go over to the showdown board and let's grab Lucy here. Okay, so If you've got a melee weapon, this is your threat radius. These are the spaces you can attack. As you can see, it's 4. It's not much at all, and it means you need to get right next to a monster in order to be able to hit them. This is the default situation for survivors. But say if you have range 2 or reach 2, suddenly you've got this as your options. That's 12 spaces. That's a huge increase in where you can threaten a monster from. It would allow Lucy to be on the corner of the white lion, and she could still stab it while not actually being adjacent, which could help. Now, if we look at the bone darts, and we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we fill it in like so. What we can see now, and I'm just going to do a quarter of the area, so imagine it's in all quadrants. Suddenly, from our starting position here, Lucy can hit the white lion without moving. And if she is on a direct line, which I will show now. Oh, sorry, Lucy, wrong button. Pick her up. If she's on a direct line, so like so, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if she's here, she is quite a large distance away from the white line, and that will help keep her safe. So this is the benefit of ranged. You have a longer distance that you can get a threat on the monster to be able to attack it, and you are further away, so the monster is typically less likely to target you, and that is absolutely fantastic. Many ranged weapons, as a consequence, pay for their range by being cumbersome, which means you can't move and shoot with them. Bone darts absolutely do not have that. The final thing we want to consider is the attack profile. So this is a single speed hitting 40% of the time with 3 strength. There's actually one more thing we got to talk about after this, but let's talk about the strength. So 3 strength, this means 5+ wounding the monster, amazing. Even better with survival of the fittest, and it's a big reason why I'm not as high on the bone axe as I could be, because bone darts does the job. Here's the thing though, it's really unfun to roll 1 dice, and so bone darts can feel utterly demoralizing to use, because you can have streaks where you're missing and missing and missing, and you genuinely feel like you're not doing anything at all in the early game. So there's a mental fortitude needed if you're going to grab all bone darts, and that's a big part of the reason why I often say you may be taking bone blades, and even though they have lower strength, and I wouldn't be telling you off for it, I wouldn't be saying you're wrong, I wouldn't be disagreeing at all, because I get it, this is a toll. But you always are going to be crafting one of these if you're going to be hunting a white lion. And those of you who've done this before and have had this encounter coming up, you know exactly what I'm going to be talking about. You probably figured out already why this card is sitting here. So let's look at a party killer in the early game. Say hello to ground fighting. Now this is an advanced AI card, so it's not guaranteed to be something that the level 1 white lion is doing. In fact, it's relatively uncommon. But when it does this, the chances of a party wipe jump up dramatically. So let's look at this. The monster flops onto its side, waiting for attackers to draw near. While ground fighting is in play, do not draw AI. Okay, so it's not going to move anywhere. It's not going to do anything at all. It's going to sit here with this mood in play. When a survivor spends an activation in the zone of death, which is these spaces all around the monster, including these corner spots, which is quite interesting. Monsters get very unusual zones when compared to survivors. Well, before resolving the action, the monster performs a basic action with +2 speed and +1 damage targeting the survivor. The basic action for the white lion is 2 speed, 2+1 damage. This one is 4 speed, 2+ to hit, and 2 damage per hit. You could typically expect to take between 6 and 8 damage from an average attack on this. If you take 2 damage to a location in the starting game, you're probably taking it to an unarmored location, and it's going to hit your heavy box if it doesn't get straight to severe injuries. So you'll get knocked down, your attack will be cancelled because you're knocked down. You're probably going to die because you don't get rid of ground fighting. The white lion still sits there and goes, who's next? And then lazily claws that poor survivor to pieces. But if we manage to wound the white lion, we'll discard ground fighting. Now, that means if we get to attack from anywhere outside this zone, like say here, hey, we get to attack with impunity, okay? The monster's not going to do its trigger. It may do some reactions, sure, but it's not going to do its trigger. So what ground fighting becomes, once you have a bone dart, is an incredibly useful tool. Essentially, if a white lion ground fights against you, you just loot every single terrain on the board that you can. You set up in the best possible position that you can manage, and then you just let your bone dart survivor chuck darts until they eventually hit, get rid of ground fighting, and then you fight normally. So ground fighting kind of becomes get all of the terrain that you want to interact with, plus have a free wound against the monster, and that's amazing. So your first bones should always be a bone darts if you're going to be hunting the white lion. You can avoid this if you're going to be hunting the Gorm first, but be aware the Gorm has its own dangers and scares, and that's not a core game monster. Okay, let's get on to one of my favourite weapons in the entire game. This is the Bone Club. It was introduced in the 1.5 update. It costs 3 bones to craft, and it's the weapon equivalent of Rawhide armour. So that's the big claim I'm going to make. I'm going to say you could craft this in Lantern Year 1 and you could be using it in Lantern Year 30. Let's talk about why. And why this is maybe one of the best designed weapons in the entire game, on top of just being one of the outright best there. First up, there are 2 negative keywords we've not seen before that we need to talk about. Two-handed. Most of the time two-handed doesn't really matter, but there are some things that want you to use specifically one-handed weapons, and additionally, if you suffer a dismembered arm, you can't activate a two-handed weapon anymore. So it is a negative keyword. It's one of those ones you just kind of roll with the punches because, yeah, you have to pay this cost, so you don't worry too much about it. A good thing to do, though, is put Dried Acanthus on a two-handed weapon fighter if you have space for it, so you can protect that arm if you get the dismembered arm result. So that's something. That's one way of mitigating everything. The second keyword it has is heavy. Heavy is a really negative keyword. Really, really negative. There's a number of things that punish survivors for heavy gear in the game. The probably most notorious of them we have over here. So let's look at this. This is cracks in the ground. Now, the result we care about is this one here. If you roll a 1, any returning survivors with heavy gear are dead. Archive any heavy gear in the dead survivors' gear grids. It is lost with their body. That's really bad. You lose your survivor when they return. Sucks, but survivors are ultimately expendable. But also, you lose all of the heavy gear in the grid. And this isn't even if you're wearing heavy gear, this is if you're carrying it. So you lose weapons, etc. But heavy gear tends to be so good that you just kind of roll with this, and if you're concerned about cracks in the ground, Survival of the Fittest will let you re-roll this and get one of these 2 results instead, so it doesn't hurt as much. Cracks in the ground is usually a dead survivor, like half the time, but a dead survivor plus losing all heavy gear is really, really bad. So I would recommend you get Survival of the Fittest if you're going to be leaning into heavy gear a lot. That's not all, though. On top of those 2, we also have this down here, and I'm going to talk about this cumbersome on melee weapons before I go over and discuss club as a weapon type. So, Cumbersome means that you have to spend your movement in order to be able to activate the weapon. Typically this is found on ranged weapons. You'll notice very rarely you have ranged weapons like the bone darts that let you move and attack, but normally they won't, and they'll be like the bone club here with cumbersome. But cumbersome on a melee weapon, that's a huge drawback, because until you have dash you can't move and attack, so you need to start your turn next to the monster, otherwise you're not going to be able to attack it. It's a huge negative, it's absolutely massive. But it is absolutely worth it. Let's look at club. So club specialization is pretty good, but it's not something you need in the early game, because it requires a fair bit of setup. You want the right kind of survivor. When attacking with a club, on a perfect hit, you double your wound attempt total on the first selected hit location. Amazing. So you're going to want stuff that improves your perfect hit range. The Fighting Art Timeless Eye is one of those things to keep an eye out for. The Mastery plays into this further with, if you score a successful wound attempt and it's greater than or equal to twice the monster's toughness, you inflict an additional wound. That will stack with anything else that's inflicting additional wounds also. Ultimately, this is an okay mastery, but it's not a priority. It's just going to happen along the way. So we still haven't gotten to the point where I'm justifying the existence of this bone club and why I am making such a big claim with it being one of my favourite weapons and one of the best. First of all, we have the affinities. Amazing affinity, and this affinity is actually over here really good as well. And we are going to look at that in just a moment. But let's get to the reward for all of this. 5 strength. 5 strength is huge. You wound a toughness 8 monster on a 3+. You wound a phoenix with 10 toughness on a 5+. 60% of the time, if a phoenix comes near you, you can brain it with the bone club, and it does the job. That is incredible in itself. But the real treat is how powerful and synergist this is with almost every single armor type in the game. So let's pop over here and look at, this gear grid. Okay, we have here the Rawhide club tank. So this is a build that you can do if you have the bone club, and it is essentially a support tank DPS all rolled into one. This is like a jack of all trades, and it's a really good build to make in order to help your friends have more fun by doing the flashier jobs, because this does tons of grunt work and holds the line. Essentially, the plan is this. If you start the turn next to the monster, you're going to smack it with your bone club. Boom. Simple. Damage done. If you are not next to the monster to start your turn, you're going to go last out of all of the survivors, and then when it comes to your act, if you still can't get close to it, you're going to use the Rawhide headband, which, just as a quick reminder, lets you control the monster's AI by manipulating it. That means not only do you know what the monster's going to do, you get to curate it, so you can step to the spot where the monster's going to come, and you can be there and be like, come at me bro, I'm gonna smack you one with my big old club. Additionally, this scales even further because it has 2 red affinities right here, so it works with the Monster Tooth Necklace, pushing the bone club to 7 strength. That's not on this gear grid because I've just demonstrated a flex option here with the bone darts. This is something else you can do when you are not adjacent, and also AI manipulation isn't really what you want to be doing, but this is very optional. Both of these slots are optional. Dried Acanthus is great, Monster Tooth Necklace is great, Bandages is great. There's a whole load of different things you can run in these 2 slots. It's nice just to have a 7 slot thing. So that's the Rawhide synergy, which isn't immediately apparent, but hopefully you see now. It basically allows you to run 2 rolls and switch between them. We also have synergy with all of these armor sets of varying degrees. So first of all, White Lion armor, you have Pounce. Pounce lets you move 3 spaces in a straight line and activate a melee weapon with +1 strength. that works with the bone club. It's specifically outlined on there, you see, pounce, charge, etc. So that's one thing you can do, and White Lion armor loves red affinities. Then we have the Screaming armor, which has slam, which lets you, let's just get the proper thing, there we are. Slam lets you full move forward in a straight line, and if you move 4 or more spaces, you stop adjacent to the monster, you knock it back 1 and it gets -1 toughness till the end of the round. On top of that, with the full set, you get the Skewer, which means then you spend your activation to move 1 space and activate a melee weapon with +2 strength. It doesn't have the spear synergy, because normally Screaming armor these days is a spear set, but you can still do that. Effectively, you get +2 strength here, and you reduce the monster's toughness until the end of the round, helping everyone else out. So, White Lion, Bone Club, yes. Screaming armor, Bone Club, yes. It works also with leather armor. This is kind of the weakest synergy. As you can see, there's no direct synergy with the leather armor, but the leather boots do give you an ability to move 1 space, and also leather armor is a fantastic tanking set with a great utility and options, so you might go far as becoming a leather bone daddy. That was awful, why did I say that? But yeah, that might be something you decide to do in the mid-campaign. Then we have Phoenix armor, very straightforward. Again, it has this charge ability here, and so that will synergize, letting you dash at the monster and hit it. Add the number of spaces you move to your strength to this attack is even better, so the weapon starts hitting harder and harder. But we're not done. When we get right to the end game, we have Lantern armor, the highest tech level core game armor, and it's a club set. The extra weight is great leverage. All clubs in your gear grid game sharp. +2 accuracy with club weapons. Okay, so now we've got a sharp bone club that is hitting right on a 4+. That's amazing. That makes up for not being able to attack in the blind spot. Additionally, Lantern armor's slow, and you get weighed down by the chest piece. The way to handle that is the Lantern Greaves, but they require red puzzle affinities. The Bone Club provides them. So all of that is absolutely why I really rate the Bone Club, because you can use it with just about any core game armor set and get a good benefit. But it isn't so powerful that it doesn't have downsides. It is cumbersome, it is two-handed, it is heavy, there's a lot to juggle and think about, so it isn't brainless. But spending 3 bones on this is genuinely a great thing to be doing. It's a wonderful reward. Right, we have a few more items to get through, and this video has run quite long, so Skull Helm. Skull Helm costs either 2 bones or a skull. It gives you a headpiece with 3 armor points. It is fragile. This is a negative keyword, and additionally it has this downside of when you suffer a severe head injury, the skull helm is destroyed and it gets archived. But this is a lot of armor points, so there's a few reasons you would craft this. Number 1, if you get a skull and you have already managed to craft all your weapons, I really think you should craft a skull helm. You get a lot of utility out of having it around, and the head is a location that often gets specifically targeted with the headhunter skill, and also head hits, head severe injuries are way more lethal. You're twice as likely to suffer really bad stuff or die when you get hit in the head. And this self-archiving thing down here, heck, that's like worst case scenario. You probably shouldn't be suffering that, very rarely. Additionally though, there are 2 other wonderful synergies that one should think about. The first one is with People of the Skull, where this is one of the few armor pieces that they can wear on their head, and it loses its negatives, so it's great. And the other one is with the Lion Knight. There is a armor set called Brawler Armor that uses this as a part of it, so you could craft this early knowing that later on it's going to become a fantastic endgame piece of armor. So that's it with Skull Helms. This down red is not great. It's not very good, but at least it's an affinity. That's nice. And so my recommendation is, if you have a skull and you've got the weapons that you want from the Bonesmith, consider crafting this, especially in campaigns with the Lion Knight, and also it is an auto craft in People of the Skull. Right. Last of all, we have our tools, Bone Pickaxe and Bone Sickle. These are kind of like synergies, they're analogues to each other. The Bone Pickaxe is slow with higher strength, and it generates this hunt event, mineral gathering. I'm going to go through that in detail in the future, but the main, and so I'm not going to get into it here. The main thing to note is that this generates iron. You're going to want iron in the end game for building a whole bunch of different armor sets and weapons. So you're going to be making these. And they break during that event, so you're going to be making them again and again. So that you can't have too many bone pickaxes, and you kind of want to have a space on as many survivors as possible to carry these into the hunt. Additionally, it's worth noting that tool and pickaxe are both positive keywords. This is not a weapon, also, it's an item, which is another positive keyword synergy. So I will talk about where these synergies occur in the future, because they're with expansion monsters, but for now, I just want to say that everything on this is really good. This attack profile, you're not going to be attacking with this without certain other synergies, but it is there as a pinch. The Bone Sickle, over here, on the other hand, let's just slide that into the middle. It has 2 speed and 1 strength. That is worse, so it's less likely to become an attacking weapon. And sickle isn't a massively relevant keyword at the moment, but it generates the herb gathering event on a hunt space. That provides survival, that can provide acanthus, that can provide even sometimes affinities if you're really lucky. It's great, but I don't think you need more than one of these under any circumstance. Now, the big thing to consider with the tools is they require ammonia and they require leather. So these 2 slots here don't do anything until you have the leather worker open, and that makes the bonesmith kind of like partially a leather worker location. So just be aware of that, and never forget these are here because they're great value. Try and construct gear grids with a space to hold a sickle or a pickaxe, so you can take them out on hunts every single time. You will be rewarded for that. But of course you need ammonia, which is up here. Just going to highlight ammonia. Again, you can get ammonia either by innovating, or preferably you can get it from the White Lion Hunt events, or a Gorm AI card will do it. So I'll talk more about ammonia when we do the weapon, the leather worker. So ultimately, let's put a pin in that, and let's do our final wrap up, shall we? So the Bonesmith is, in my opinion, an essential location to unlock. It provides you that stepping stone from fists and founding stones towards Node 1 monster weapons. There are some very efficient options in here. There are some quite situational ones, and there are some really, really good ones. Ultimately, the first bone should be spent on bone darts, unless you're never going to hunt a white lion. Bone blades are perfectly acceptable options. I would generally pick them in Survival of the Fittest more than I would in a Protect the Young or a settlement lacking in birth principle, because they haven't had a intimacy succeed yet. Bone axe is very, very situational. Bone dagger we'll come back to when we talk about the Catarium. Bone club is amazing, but genuinely expensive. The skull helm, well, I would make this for the skull. I'd craft it for 2 bones late in a campaign if I had the brawler armor set available to craft, and then these I think are must crafts, but they're more mid-game options. So that's it. That's the Bonesmith, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you for tolerating my flubs, stammers, and when I've used the wrong word, or I've gotten off topic, or dithered, or whatever. I do these in like one take, because I don't have an editor, and I don't really have the skill and expertise to edit these myself. Maybe that will change in the future when I can afford to hire someone. If you want to see more of my work, you can catch me at my Patreon, where I put out a written article on boss battlers, usually Kingdom Death, once a week on Fridays. Otherwise, I will be back again next Wednesday with the first of our crafting level 2 settlement locations, probably the Leatherworker. So, goodbye.